Hi, this is Paul. I got a comment on today's video from MJ, who's a regular commenter. And there's a number of elements to the comment, and I thought it would make a good topic for a video. Paul, you often remark on your dwindling church attendance, and so always brings up the question for me, have you considered reinvesting the time and attention you place in this little corner in innumerable hours of podcast consumption, content creation, conference attendance back to your church community? I've been at this church 25 years, and I can talk a little bit about my time here, which I might do. The antidote to your dying church problem seems fairly obvious from my point of view. That's often what people think, until, of course, they are doing it. And I thought I would touch base on that a little bit from, again, the point of the movie. Because in the point of the movie, again, the movie gives a very clean narrative, and that's what Hollywood movies do. They sort of clean it up, and they make everything just fast, crystal clear, black and white, and that's the power of Hollywood movies. If you look at the story itself, and again, I mentioned this book. God's Forever Family, and they had a section on Chuck Smith and Costa Mesa and Lonnie Frisbee and the rise that the movie covers. And the largest single embodiment of the developing Jesus movement in Southern California was Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa. Its pastor, balding middle-aged Chuck Smith, had tired of denominational politics and bureaucracy and left the International Church of the Foursquare Gospel, the denomination founded by Aimee Semper McPherson. Now, one of my far too numerous unfinished projects is to do a little bit of work into the history of Aimee Semper McPherson. It's a tremendously fascinating story that touches on a lot of different issues that we sort of touch on. Well, Chuck Smith had been a part of that, and of course Aimee Semper McPherson in the earlier part of the 20th century had been this enormous force that had really changed a ton of things. And I read an intro to one of her biographies recently. Maybe I should do that again. Oh yeah, here it is. On a brisk evening in 1934, 6,000 people jammed into the exotic Shrine Auditorium, the largest and poshest theater in Los Angeles. I read this in a previous video. It's the prologue to that book that I just held up. Why aren't you doing for me what I expect you to, computer? With multiple monitors, Kindle wants to change the page and it puts it on a monitor away from the thing. You know, Aimee Semper McPherson was just there's this huge wave that goes through, and this has been the pattern in American Christianity, and I think overall in Christianity. Moments and leaders rise and fall, and these risings and fallings have a big impact on a lot. So Chuck Smith had been had been with the International Foursquare Church, which was founded by Aimee Semper McPherson, and that whole wave that went through in the 1930s. And after having a home Bible study in the 150-member Corona Christian Center, aided by a daily 15-minute radio broadcast over KREL, a small AM station, Chuck was persuaded to take on the struggling Costa Mesa congregation in December 1965. The church membership numbered fewer than 30 people when Smith arrived, but in the spring of 1968, the church was a middling-sized independent congregation in conservative middle class, heavily Republican Orange County, Southeast Los Angeles. You can see already that sort of the way the movie sets things up isn't exactly true. Chuck Smith had been successful in many ways, and I would have to say that my tenure at Living Stones has also been successful. Part of the interesting thing about my tenure here was that with my time here, the church tended to grow along the lines of the people it already had, which meant that I've baptized two different men in their 70s. we often attract older women and older men into the congregation. And part of that is the demographic of the community, because this community was built in the 1960s, and many of the people here in the 1960s, we have a fair number of state workers, and so the church sort of followed that trajectory. But as that, there are these demographic groups that tend to go through, and churches are very demographically based. We're also kind of a strange church. Well, I should say that, how to say this. This church was planted in the late 50s, early 60s, and it was intended back then to be planted to pick up members, basically Christian Reformed people who would move to Sacramento from other Christian Reformed colonies that tended to be rural places. And there were actually two churches, our church and the Reformed Church of America church, that were planted at about the same time. The Reformed Church of America church was planted in the community that would have made the most sense probably for this church too, in a suburban community where basically baby boom Christian Reformed people might settle in Sacramento and go from there. But the missionary at the time found actually more response among African Americans in this South area, and so the church was planted here. And so that sort of led to this church in the 60s and 70s being what I sometimes sort of call a racial reconciliation church. In the wake of the civil rights movement, there were always some people who were interested in crossing racial lines to be part of a church that had black and white. Now in California, that would mean not just African Americans, but Hispanics, people from different, people from Japan, Chinese individuals, people from Hawaii. So this is an extraordinarily diverse community. And so this church did that. And so this church in the 1960s and 70s was quite successful in sort of being a suburban church when this was a suburban community. In the 1980s, churches or cities in California sort of grow out like rings. In the 1980s, the growing edge of the city began to change, and communities like this became more distressed. This community had wider streets, larger homes from the 50s and 60s, and so when the state mental hospitals were closed down, group homes started to move in. And during the 80s and 90s, the community had quite a bit of deterioration, and the leadership of the church, let's see, I'm not going to name names just because all these people are dead actually anyway, but the leadership of the church was quite aggressive evangelistically, would go door to door, and that really worked, and it really worked for him. And so the church reached its peak during that period. And then he was quite aggressive missiologically. He also was a guy who sort of wore his heart on his sleeve. He would do some things that would sort of make some of the Dutch diaspora people a little bit uncomfortable. And at one point they thought maybe the church would be better without him. And so they sort of asked him to leave. And then they called another pastor who was another former missionary, actually. And that pastor and his wife really had a heart for disabled people. And because of the conflict that was engendered by asking this founding pastor to leave, who had personally done the evangelism that had brought a lot of the people into the church, a lot of those people left when the leadership did that. And then the next pastor sort of did a lot of work with disabled people. This individual, he and his wife adopted disabled people into their family. A number of people came into the church that had disabled children. And so the ministry of the church sort of refocused on that. And the church still would sort of pick up diaspora Christian Reformed people who would come through, and they were loyal Christian Reformed people. So when they came to Sacramento, they would look for the Christian Reformed church here, and we were it. Now, a couple of things began to happen. Number one, denominational loyalty began to go down, and so the church could no longer sort of rely on Christian Reformed people moving into the city of Sacramento and joining us. The denomination decided to plant a new church out in a distant suburb a ways away from us. This church at that time saw that as a threat. They also asked this other missionary pastor to leave at one point. I believe it was about 3 years into his calling. And they kind of said in a nice way, maybe it's time you look for another call. And he didn't want to, so he stayed another 7 years. And this church had a lot of conflict. And that conflict sort of endured until I got here. And then after that pastor left, they called a seminarian right out of seminary who they very much loved. He was a classmate of mine, actually. He was a very sharp guy. He worked 40 hours a week on his sermons, crafted them carefully. In fact, when he left here, compiled a book of his sermons. People really enjoyed it, but the church didn't grow at all. The neighborhood continued to change. The church continued to sort of stay the same. People were driving in and out, and the church had a lot of conflict in it. The way I described the church when I got here is it was a sort of there were 5 committees that were sort of running the church, and the council dare not cross 3 of those committees because of some of the people who were running those committees. And so I described the church as sort of a feudal system with a few feudal lords and a very weak monarchy. That pastor was preaching such lovely sermons here in his starter church, unsurprisingly got a call to a bigger Christian Reformed church where he could really devote all of his time to crafting his well-crafted sermons. And so he left. And then there was a calling process at this church, and they were going to call really a very capable person who I eventually got to know quite well, who did a lot of other work in this classis, who probably would have been an excellent person for this church. But he had a failed marriage because of adultery, and that had been put in his past. He had left the ministry, had been reinstated, he'd come back to the ministry, but he hadn't really fully disclosed that to the congregation. And when word got out and people started hearing about that, he pulled his name out and said, I don't want to have to deal with any of this drama. So then the church was kind of in bad shape. They were actually looking to call my father before me because of my father's track record in urban ministry, and my mother had very little interest in moving out to California because they were just a few years away from retirement at the time. And so my father said, well, I can't really come, but my son is coming back from the mission field and you can talk to him. And so they talked to me. At that point, I had already had a job offer from a church in the Chicago area. And but I came out here, and it was in some ways very multi-ethnic, similar to the church that I'd grown up in. That part was attractive to me. The church also quite clearly was in a bit of distress, and the position that I was called to in a Chicago church at that time, that Chicago church, saw I would have been in a staff position. The Chicago church saw itself as really doing very well, and so I felt I was, much more needed here. And so I came out here, and I got here from the mission field, probably a little bit naive in terms of North American ministry. And I had heard all the stories of all the conflict, but with a new pastor and people sort of want to make nice. A few months into my tenure here, basically a power struggle arose, and it didn't arise over anything substantive. But like I said before, it had kind of a feudal system, and there were a few people that were sort of in power. And the way it had always worked is that if they didn't like something in the church, they would go to the pastor, and the pastor would always do what they said, regardless of what the council said. And when I got to this church, I said, look, we have a council, and we're going to do what the council wants to do. And so these people got angry, and they left, and they took a group of people with them. And so within the first year of me being at this church, we lost probably a third of our people and maybe half of our money. But I wasn't about to do what the previous pastors had done. So forward we went. And we actually picked up a fair number of people from the community because the church was a happier place. We had sort of conservative Christian Reformed people and progressive Christian Reformed people, and we sort of lost both groups and sort of kept the pragmatic Christian Reformed people and then many of the people that had come to this church from the neighborhood and sort of stuck out all of the conflict and chaos. And so also when I came to this church, the classis had a big push on, at that point, the seeker movement was sort of at its peak. And so almost all the pastors of our classis went out to Willow Creek to learn what Willow Creek was doing. And sort of the idea was, well, we're all going to sort of do the Willow Creek program for church renewal and revitalization. Well, that didn't work here. Let's just say that. We tried some things, and you can still see some elements of that still today in the liturgy of the church. But this church, the congregation of this church was just so absolutely eclectic, with all the different layers of history that had come to this church. And the one thing that held this church together was that the people loved each other. And what that means is you can't really program around music, or you can't really program around all of these other things that are really helpful, especially with the church growth methodology, to sort of attract birds of a feather in. And so I had a friend of mine in seminary who, when we left seminary, the seeker wave was still kind of going, and there was a church in Western Michigan that had hired a church advisor, and they wanted to reach unchurched people in West Michigan City, and so they had this big plan, and the big plan was, of course, typical in the 80s and 90s of ditch the organ, get a drum set, get some guitars, hire a music person who can sort of really get the music much more in a sort of watered down Jesus Revolution way, get more contemporary music in. And in the 80s and 90s, you had these fights in churches between worship styles. And so this congregation in Western Michigan said, okay, this is what we're going to really do. And, they had a committee, and they did all of that, and they had a plan. And lots of churches did that at that point. What most churches didn't expect to do was actually implement it. And so what they did was they hired a seminary right out of seminary who said, all right, we're going to implement it. And implement it he did. And as often happened in those times, once they implemented it, about a third of the congregation really didn't, even though, okay, the church approved this, blah, 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 but nothing's really going to change. Well, things changed. And a lot of people left the church, but that's in a West Michigan city. So you leave one Christian Reformed church, there are 2 or 3 others right down the road that you can go to. And so people left the church, and the program worked in many respects. And, new people were coming in, and the church was growing, yada, yada, yada. It was one of these church makeover things. Well, there was eventually some conflict, and they asked my friend to leave. And so that isn't always unusual in these cases. And so I had seen a lot of these turnaround churches that had happened. And we had been, monkeying around with playing around with some music and trying to implement some of this seeker stuff here. But after a few years of it, it became, even less than a few years of it, after not too long of it, it became abundantly clear that that was never going to work in this place. We were just too weird. We're just too eclectic. We just had too many people that didn't fit a mold. And we would continue to pick up neighbors and people in the church, but most of the people we would pick up were older. And most of the older people were sort of inactive Christians of one sort or another, or they were basically formed when Christianity was a deep part of American culture. You look at Aaron Wren's typology for some of this. And so, them joining a church wasn't a big step. Now, at the same time, in the late 90s, early aughts, myself and the other local pastors in the Christian Reformed Church, we were very aggressively planting new churches in the fast-growing areas of Sacramento. And initially, we did that with sort of seeker methodology. You get the right sound, you get the right look, you have the right messages, the pastor dresses a certain way, and people buy new homes, people buy new cars. Usually white suburban people will be interested in another church. And so that's sort of the formula for church growth. And there are different versions of it for African Americans, for Hispanics, for other immigrant groups. But Living Stones was always in some ways just too diverse and just too strange. And, part of what that one pastor did with his heart for, so the first pastor was sort of a missionary pastor. He was the church planter, and he he saw that African Americans were really interested in a church that wasn't just there were a group of African Americans that were interested in a church that wasn't just like all the other black churches in the neighborhood. That's similar to some of what happened at Northside where I was growing up. The second pastor really had an evangelistic heart, went door to door and ministered to people one-on-one and had a real gift for that. The church really grew and flourished under him with respect to the people that were sort of his people, that he really brought in and brought up and mentored and discipled and all of that. A lot of the other Christian Reformed people were just sort of on the sidelines and, maybe they were part of the program. Maybe this was just their church, but some of those people at some point took issue with some things and wanted to change. And then the third minister that they brought in had a heart for the disabled. And like I said, part of what happened in the 80s in this neighborhood was that a lot of group homes came into the neighborhood. So there were a lot of disabled people and mentally ill people. That would, of course, set up some of the homeless stuff that I talk about in this neighborhood. And so he brought in a number of families who had children with disabilities or family members with disabilities. So, and then the next pastor comes in, and he's just a sort of a cathedral church preacher. And so there's a certain element of this church, sort of CRC progressives at that point that weren't really progressives on our scale today. He was really their guy, and he would preach wonderful sermons, and many of these people would drive in from distant suburbs, and this was the CRC, and they were loyal to it, and he would preach good sermons, and he did preach good sermons, and they would do some innovative things with liturgy, and so that was okay, but still there was just always tension underneath the congregation. And when I came and when I sort of naively in some ways said no to some of these power brokers, and then we also at one point then sort of implemented a small group strategy, which I saw as probably better than sort of a stage front strategy like a seeker service for the church, because I could see that the church really did need and had a hunger for community within it. And so actually the small groups worked quite well. A lot of the other people just checked out, and they found wonderful Presbyterian churches closer to their home. And another issue that some people said was that we had a cadre of young people who were, getting towards their teenage years, and their parents wanted a suburban church with a closer youth group. Some people here looked at that as they were unsure if they wanted their young people maybe finding romantic partners of another race. There's some tension underneath with some of those issues. And that's where a very diverse congregation is a very complex congregation. So after those 5 pastors, all with their own unique gifts, I come in. And of course, I've got my own unique gifts too. And in some ways, I was a blend of some of these people in that I had been raised and formed in an urban church that ministered sort of to the least of these. People were a little surprised that dealing with the mental illness and the homelessness didn't really throw me, because I'd grown up with all of that stuff in Patterson. So, and so, for a while we had some pretty good growth, but our growth was mostly in the demographic that we already had, especially in the community. And so a lot of those people are older, and we didn't grow a lot. And then at that point also, this constant trickle of Christian Reformed people who would say graduate from Calvin College and move to Sacramento for a job and then join the Christian Reformed Church, that stopped. And if you look at my conversations about why the Christian Reformed Church is changing, that's one of the reasons. And plus, we had all of these other new church plants that tended to be filled with young white families, and most of those people from Calvin College, based suburban families, basically fit in better in all of those churches than they would fit into this very odd, strange little church. And so, yeah, for 20 years, I did that. And at some point, I pretty much knew, some turnaround church strategies basically involve alienating your present congregation in the hopes of leveraging maybe a little minority in the church and the church facilities and resources to try to plant a church within a church. And usually what happens is you have a big church fight, and often the church doesn't actually succeed. Turnaround churches are pretty unusual, and their leadership is pretty unusual. So at one point I basically decided we're going to go with what we got, and we're going to love people as they come in the door, with all of their uniqueness and with all of their oddities, and we'd often have some people that would have a vision for that, and they loved the diversity and they loved the strangeness of it, and so this was the kind of church they're looking for. But it's not a consumer church. And often churches that grow in America grow either because the pastor has a particular gift that really facilitates the growth. I made that video about Scott Vanderplug, and I should have him on the channel sometime. He has a super gift of discipleship, and so he's taken a little missions church in Florida and really built it into a mega church. And it's a very special guy with a very special gift. Wasn't my gift. And so I pretty much knew that, things were going to sort of go their own way here. But then, of course, the YouTube thing happened. And so actually, MJ, if you would ask my counsel would say, no, actually, you have to keep doing the YouTube thing, because, there are a number of people out there who support this channel by supporting this church. And this church would probably be closed. I mean, we certainly couldn't have done the parking lot project, and we certainly couldn't make budget if many of the people who watch this channel would stop supporting this church. And then, of course, COVID happened, and that really, we had some members who were living at a distance, but they were already getting up older and couldn't drive in, and so there were more members gone, and so sort of been what's happening. And, we have people who come in for estuary and people who come in for church on Sunday morning because I'm on YouTube. So, no, I don't think my counsel would tell me to stop. I think my counsel says keep going, because what many of the people of the church see is that, well, actually, this is a way for this church to actually do some vital ministry. And so here we are on YouTube. Back to Chuck Smith's story. So he, actually was doing okay as a moderate church planter. Under his leadership, the church underwent a modest renaissance, seeing its attendance climb from nearly 200 a week and building program put in place. As Smith went into business of shepherding his suburban flock, his wife Kay began to express an increasing concern for the hippies gathering at nearby Huntington Beach. Armed with an Orange County conservatives' revulsion for hippies and all they stood for, Smith would go with his wife to gawk at the long-haired youth. And again, you see this in the movie with this scene where they're looking at the TV. I saw them as parasites upon society, recalled Smith during his 2000 interview. My original thought was, why don't they cut their hair and get a job and live a decent life? And again, you hear that in the story, because movies sort of take a distillation, put a clean narrative, and that's what they do. As far as he was concerned, they were definitely a threat to society. They were radicals, smoking marijuana, dropping LSD, disrupting things, challenging the status quo, and he wanted nothing to do with them. Eventually, his wife's concern for the hippies' temporal and eternal needs began to melt Smith's resistance, and began to think about how they might make contact with these prodigal youth. So, again, the clean story of his daughter seeing Lonnie Frisbee walking on the road, bringing him to the kitchen table, having this life transformation. I mean, that's just typical Hollywood stuff. Ministry almost never works that way. It's always a slog. It is a slog, my friends, most of the time. And then sometimes things go whoosh and off they go. Through his teenage daughter, her fiance, so no fiance showed up in the movie, Smith was introduced to a number of the beach hippies, including newly arrived Lonnie Frisbee, a Costa Mesa native who had just come for a visit home from San Francisco Bay Area, has an involvement with the House of Acts living room. Now, if you read the whole book, you'll see that there's basically this movement happening. And this is where I think we can talk about movements, spirits, because there's things happening all over the place and it's bubbling up and things are coming together. That's really the way things change. To Smith's surprise, Frisbee turned out, in spite of his flower child appearance, to be an enthusiastic Christian. Impressed by Frisbee's love of Jesus and his spirit-filled personality, Smith eventually asked him to serve as something of an unofficial missionary to the Huntington Beach hippies, giving Smith a chance to learn about the current crop of kids and what made them tick. So very much adopting a missionary model. Frisbee agreed to begin to preach and testify at Huntington Beach and other local hippie hangouts. Soon Frisbee convinced his reluctant wife Connie to leave the big house up in Novato, and the pair relocated to Orange County to work with Calvary Chapel. And again, if you read the book, you can read about these houses that developed and how this whole thing sort of bubbled up and the way it did. The slight Jesus look-alike evangelizing proved effective, and soon Frisbee and a growing corps of long-haired, casually attired, barefoot and sandaled youth were beginning to troop in amid the buttoned-down, straight congregation of Calvary Chapel. Given the rootless, runaway status of many of these young people, however, it became apparent that ministering to them would entail more than the opportunity to avail themselves of Calvary Chapel's regular services and meetings. Many of the new converts needed a place to live, food to eat, and an atmosphere where Bible reading and prayer could replace drugs and sex as their main pastimes. And again, if I look at my father's ministry in Patterson, one of the things that Little Northside Chapel did was help with the support of other congregations in the community start the Northside Addicts Rehabilitation Center, or NARC, really clever name, where they were helping people get off heroin. Heroin was sort of going through Patterson at that time. In response to this need, Smith started talking to another young convert who had linked up with Calvary Chapel. John Higgins was the 29-year-old Irish Catholic from New York City, managing a door-to-door magazine subscription crew. He had been converted in May 1965 while reading a Gideon Bible in a hotel room. Frustrated by the Catholic priest's lack of response to his questions about the Bible and prophecy, "They really literally just laughed at me," Higgins responded. And again, there's really a biblicism that's in this movement. That's very much a part of it. He had brought to a Bible study hosted by Chuck Smith in late 1966 and eventually underwent the baptism of the Holy Spirit. My eyes were opened. Now remember, Chuck Smith's lineage, and served the Lord. Interested in the hippies, he grew out his hair long. And you see this pattern in the book. Someone will come, they're a Christian, they want to minister to these people. What do they do? Oh, I'm not having the text in. What do? They adopt the hairstyle. They adopt the mannerisms. They go missionary. Interested in the hippies, he grew out his hair and added a beard to begin evangelizing local youth. Inspired by hearing youth worker David Wilkerson speak at nearby Melodyland Christian Center in Anaheim, Higgins was interested in starting up some sort of group living center similar to Wilkerson's Teen Challenge and began taking new converts into his house. Smith then invited Higgins, now Higgins doesn't even show up in the movie. Smith then invited Higgins to bring his house idea into Calvary Chapel and operate under the church's aegis. Working together, Smith and Higgins found an apartment in late April 1968 to house some of their born-again hippies. It rapidly proved too small, and a two-bedroom house in Costa Mesa was rented as Calvary Chapel's first communal house, the House of Miracles, which opened on May 17, 1968. Lonnie and Connie Frisbee were then brought in, and along with Higgins were appointed as co-leaders. Calvary Chapel paid $50 of the monthly $90 rent. Think about that, $90 rent in Southern California. $90 rent and provided living expenses for the house staff and perhaps an occasional portion of money needed for utilities and food. But the assistance was not nearly enough to handle the flood of kids who piled into the modest bungalow. Within the first week, there's some intimations of that in the movie. Within the first week, more than 30 new hippie Christians needed to be fed. Connie Bremer Frisbee recalled that life in the house was tough. "I would have to borrow a bicycle to go dumpster diving. We got some canned food. I would walk around and solicit help from people, neighbors seething about the swarm of scruffy kids descending on their subdivision. Overcrowding intensified as one runaway girl named Cherice was converted. By herself, she was responsible for bringing more than 50 people to the house in one 3-week period. And again, it's very interesting when I look back over my 25 years at Living Stones, there's 2 individuals, I won't name them. Many of the people that came to this church in the 25 years I've been here came through these 2 individuals. They just had friends, and that's where I basically saw that in many ways, evangelistic growth is about infiltrating other people's networks. Led me to believe that social media is all about other people's networks. This early success and arrangement with the church people at Calvary Chapel apparently proved daunting to Frisbee, and he sought advice from his former members in the Bay Area. In response, Ken Philpott, David Hoyt, and these are mentioned earlier in the book, and others from evangelical concerns backed group piled into a car and drove to Orange County to investigate the arrangement. While they knew Frisbee was gifted in dealing with people one-on-one, they were unsure about his leadership potential. We didn't really feel strongly about Frisbee, said Philpott. I never really heard him speak to a group because he was a nobody. He would never have been entrusted even to lead a Bible study back in San Francisco. One evening, the San Francisco group sat down with Frisbee and Chuck Smith and his elders at the House of Miracles. They sat in chairs and all had coats and ties on. We all sat on the floor, remembered Philpott. As they listened to the details of the situation, the Bay Area Christians were convinced that Smith's guidance would be a real plus. Reassured, Frisbee plunged full ahead into his role as hippie evangelist at Calvary Chapel. There was much to do. With the House of Miracles overflowing and people sleeping in the backyard, a search quickly began for other facilities to house the growing stream of converts and inquirers. A sympathetic evangelical judge stepped forward with an old rundown motel he owned in Riverside, 15 miles to the east. With materials provided by some of Smith's contacts and labors from the hippies, the hotel was made habitable in early June. With 4 elders, 2 of them under 20, in charge, the new facility absorbed the overflow from the Costa Mesa house. The Riverside house's residents quickly set to work on witnessing and preaching in the city's streets. Within a week, 65 young people had been saved and subsequent baptisms in the hotel's old fish ponds. At the end of the summer, it was claimed that more than 500 young people, including several members of the Diablos motorcycle gang, had been converted through the efforts of these old motels. And again, one of the things you learn is that like people could do evangelism to like people often much more effectively than people who have to hop over a cultural gap. And that cultural gap might be sort of the generation gap between the squares and the hippies. You see this all the time. And this is why, in terms of foreign missions, one of the key things is, well, you see it in the New Testament. It's always the case. It's the way people work. Nonetheless, the work among hippies continued. The Risen Sun Coffee House ministries were a big part of this movement. The Risen Sun Coffee House was opened across from the Greyhound bus station in Santa Ana, and communal houses overseen by Calvary Chapel, Philadelphia House, Mansion Messier, 1 Corinthians House, and other dilapidated motels in Newport Beach. The Blue Top multiplied in and around Orange County. And there's sort of a copycat syndrome to this kind of thing, too. And, even by the 80s, I started college in 1981. There were still some of these places around, but, the bloom was well off the rose by that point. But even in Grand Rapids, there was a communal living house where Christians were practicing community get-together. And, of course, I had grown up around enough of this stuff in New Jersey. And my father's church, my father's church wasn't really at the center of this. This and sort of the racial reconciliation movement sort of came together. And, if you want to see how this kind of thing really goes, you're better off reading a book because you can pack so much more detail into a book. You see a movie, you feel the whoosh and you feel the feels and you do all of that. But if you sort of imagine that this is the way it goes, it never goes like it goes in a movie. In fact, I've had conversations with people who have gone whoosh in seeker churches, and because what happens is someone is a success, and then once someone is a success, everybody flocks there to figure out what they're doing to maybe be able to replicate the success. And in many ways, It's kind of what I did with Jordan Peterson. You know, it's, hey, that's why I saw stuff moving towards Jordan Peterson. And so I say to my friends and colleagues, hey, stuff is moving here. You know, don't wait, because these things only go for a few years and then they kind of settle into something else, and then they usually have bigger ripples. And that's exactly the same for this movement here. Only, of course, the Jesus People movement was a massive thing in the ways that it changed the American church. You know, much larger than the Jordan Peterson movement, at least so far. Who knows where this whole thing goes? But this is how stuff works. And so then I'm doing this in my dying church, and, you know, my people are like, hey, you know, Pastor, we love our little church. We love each other. We want to keep it open. Your YouTube channel is helping to keep our little church open, so we want you to keep being our pastor. The YouTube channel is helping you continue to be our pastor, so keep doing it. Because, quite frankly, in 25 years of being here, this has shown more promise than anything else I've ever done. So, yeah. Your antidote to a dying church problem seems fairly obvious. Well, there's a lot of churches with a lot of capable people that are dying. It's just the reality of it. And there are churches with some real scoundrels that are growing. Just pay attention to this stuff. You see it all the time. There's plenty of documentaries on Netflix and Amazon about church growth scoundrels. They're all over the place. But I'll have to talk about that, you know, preaching in Philippians now, because God uses those scoundrels. And part of, you know, even if you read something like the book of Acts is so sparse. Now, Lonnie Frisbee helped found Calvary Chapel and the Vineyard. But of course, the Vineyard and Calvary Chapel also had roots into other old movements, such as Chuck Smith's connection to the Foursquare Church, which goes all the way back to Amy Semper McPherson, and that wave that goes through. And that tends to be how things work. Also, do you view your work on YouTube and Estuary as a successor to your pastorship at Living Stones? Well, that we will have to see. You know, again, I've spoken openly. If for whatever reason Living Stones no longer is a viable congregation, I think it would be wrong of me to stop this. Now, how then do I do this? To become a YouTuber? Do I write a book or two? Because you get different access when you write a book, because different people take you seriously rather than just talking out loud on the internet. And I'll take that as it comes, because I've taken this whole thing as it comes. And we'll cross one bridge when we come to it. Similar to Chuck Smith with his church-adjacent House of Miracles commune, see, MJ knows a little something about the story, and his small Costa Mesa church developing into Calvary Chapel movement, do you see yourself in this little corner and estuary headed in a similar direction? I doubt it. We haven't really had a whoosh. What we have is a small group of people who, not unlike Living Stones, find that they like each other most of the time, and have some sort of commonality, and are playing with some stuff that seems, why not? Why not get together? Now, MJ has a whole bunch of reasons why he thinks that's, he's got reasons why not, but I've had my share of failures in my life, and freedom of assembly is something guaranteed by the American Constitution, and people getting together and swapping stories doesn't seem like a bad idea. So, wonder if you can touch on these things in a future video. There you go. This is your answer. So you got a little bit of the taste of my story in the church here, and a little bit of the taste I mean, when I got here in the 90s, I was very diligent in wanting to help this church turn around. You know, in some ways I was responsible for losing a good bit of its membership, but that was probably something that needed to happen. And the people went to other fine churches, so And part of the reason why I don't want to close this church down is because a lot of the people here wouldn't have any place to go, and they wouldn't go anywhere. So the place goes down, they don't have a church. And the current arrangement means I can hold estuary meetings here. And it's been a super cool ministry, and I think God has blessed it. And I've said this before, I'm frankly glad we haven't had a whoosh, or at least a bigger whoosh. If a whoosh comes, if the Lord brings a whoosh, we'll get on that board and we'll ride it as best we can. The thing is, I've seen other whooshes, and they're messy. I mean, again, just that little reading there, it's messy. I remember, so I grew up, and my father's church was a little bit of a whoosh because it was a countercultural Christian Reformed church in a rather significant sized historic CRC colony area. So you had Christian Reformed youth who were sort of, kind of swept up in the counterculture thing, but they weren't ready to leave the Christian Reformed church so they could be Christian Reformed and explore the counterculture thing. And by that, I don't mean drugs. I mean racial reconciliation. And even my father's church, at first we just sang out of the Psalter hymnal, and more brought in some African-American music and brought in some African-American musicians, and did a summer camp and had a daycare center and had a food bank. And I mean, my father was a networker and was able to sort of leverage himself as a bridge person between the resources in the broader Christian Reformed Church in northern New Jersey, and help to involve them in the ministry of Northside Chapel. And perhaps in some ways I'm doing a similar thing. We're all gifted in different ways, and there are things I do well and things I don't do well. And hopefully in time, God both develops gifts and puts us where he wants us, and bears fruit. So most of the church doesn't grow through a whoosh. Most of the church, I mean, we used to, when we were doing a lot of church planting, one of the things we talked about is, what do you call someone who plants a church and in 3 years has over 1,000 people? Call them lottery winners, because they're that rare. Something like 3/4 of all church plants fail. Generally speaking, unless a church gets above 200 people within 2 years, it'll never break that barrier. There's all these metrics in church planting. This stuff is studied like you wouldn't imagine. And so I read so many books along those lines. And again, but, on one hand, turn this place into a seeker church? No. And part of the reason that, I sort of started the shape of this channel was I'd watch these church planters go out there, and I thought, boy, that looks like fun. But I love these people, and I'm their pastor, and, okay, I'm leaving you, I'm going to go plant a church somewhere. And some people suggested that I should, Paul, you should go and be a church planter. You could have a far bigger church than you have there. And maybe I'm also kind of a complex guy. And I'm not saying church planters aren't complex, but it's a different breed that can really build a big church quickly. And usually it's a whole bunch of other factors too. And if you dig into the stories of like Willow Creek or Saddleback or many of these stories, large churches, there's a whole bunch of other reasons why that church went the trajectory it did. And 4 or 5 others with equally capable leadership and equally committed and godly people, you will never hear their names. That's the way it goes in church. That's the way it goes in ministry. Ministry is work, and it's sacrificial work, and it's cruciform work, and it always is. So, and, God has blessed this little channel. God has blessed this little corner. What God will do, look at my father's ministry in Northside Chapel. That church is probably about to close at this point. Churches close. They just do. And I think we're in the midst of a major upheaval in the culture. And not unlike the Jesus Revolution, that means that usually what happens is that something new happens in the church and there's sort of a sea change. And I believe I'm part of that. I believe this channel is part of that. But what exactly God will do, don't know. Do I trust him? Yeah. So, yeah. The messiness of ministry. So, there it is. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think.